Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 4th of September, and over the past 24 hours we've seen a lot of developments in Donetsk Oblast. Starting off with the Vuhledar area, a lot of changes. Same thing with the Pokrovsk region, and then even going northwards to Chasiv Yar. There's been a significant development that has unfolded over the past hour, so we're going to talk about that by the end of the video. But first, I want to discuss the capture of the village of Prechestivka by the Russian forces. This was verified by Ukrainian sources such as Petrenko and Deep States. They echoed this, and the unit that's been involved in a lot of these operations based on their public presence talking about it is the 40th Naval Infantry Brigade. And so they were able to enter into this village, and we talked about this in earlier videos, from the southeastern direction, coming in smaller squads through these various vertical tree lines, making it in, and then fighting there for around 2 days before they were able to fully expel the Ukrainian garrison from the 58th Motorized Brigade. And you can see that unit over here. Now, the issue with this unit is that if you were to put the entirety of it in the corridor between Velika Novosilka and Vuhledar, then that would be more favorable to the Ukrainian defense in this region. Then you could say that they would have a bit more of a favorable troop density. The issue is the 58th Brigade was split in its responsibilities. On the one hand, it had to hold the line and prevent Russian frontal assaults from taking over villages along the Mokryali River, such as Mokarivka, or going northwards to Kurakhove. And so certain elements were located here to the west, and then you had another maybe battalion or just company-sized elements located near Zolotoniva and also in Prechestivka. And so it's not actually going up against a 2,000 strong cohesive units, but it's split up from its main nucleus, although it is pretty close to it because it's just a couple of kilometers to the west. And so the Ukrainian concentration defending in Prechestivka that was able to then organize counterattacks and hold on to it really did not last long. It simply didn't have the resources available to do so, especially when you're confined to only one brigade defending in that region. So the Russians were able to take it over relatively quickly. At the same time, the Ukrainian forces from the 58th Brigade, they're now withdrawing towards the village of Shakhtarske, and the 40th Brigade, they released their video of 15 Ukrainian men retreating, and you can see them then advancing northwards along this arrow towards the said village over here that I'm going over with my mouse. And it's an important village because it sort of acts as a connection in 4 directions, actually, because it connects to Uspenivka to the northeast, to the west to Velika Novosilka, to the south it connects to the front line, and to the north it connects to an area like Andriivka. And Andriivka at the moment is one of Ukraine's most important garrisons in Donetsk Oblast that has still not been affected by any means as much as the front line to Russian shelling and just the horrors of the war. And so Andriivka really is a key. It's really a gem for the Ukrainians at the moment because it's this massive hub with a lot of roads going through it. It really serves the same role that Pokrovsk served a couple of months ago before it became really a part of the throes of the front line. So now Andriivka's role is very similar, but because it is located a bit further south, it does have more of a significance for the Ukrainian garrison that is located in this corridor that I've been talking about between Velika Novosilka and Vuhledar. And so just to zoom in again and just look more at the granular details, the Russian forces have been able to take over 5.3 square kilometers. That means the western part of the village. And they've also continued advancing along the highway, which means they do have the opportunity now to take over Zolota Niva, because that village is also south of the Kashlach River, which is the very shallow river that is dividing the line of contact from the Ukrainian rear in Novoukrainka. And now the Russians, of course, they have the possibility of continuing to advance along the highway, as we talked about in yesterday's video, towards Velika Novosilka and putting pressure along a new axis, which really would be threatening for the forces there. At the same time, they could also cross the shallow river and advance along a paved road directly into Novoukrainka, which is located on relatively high elevation and will give them positions needed to then expand the attacks towards Shakhtarske, which we just talked about, or towards Bohayavlenka, which is currently this sort of conduit between the actual Ukrainian rear in an area like Uspenivka and the current defenders in Vuhledar. So you see a lot of these sort of peripheral changes occurring that aren't directly related to frontal assaults towards Vuhledar, but in the big picture, looking out, You could see how it's all building up in a way that would force the Ukrainians out, squeeze them out of this really important node. And the reason why they're not attacking frontally, at least relative to the other fronts, they're not attacking with that much of intensity towards Vuhledar itself, is very clear. It's a very strong node for the Ukrainians. They've consistently been able to hold on to it, but they have a lot of gaps, gaping holes in their lines. The most notable one is the one that I've talked about, this horizontal corridor here, only having around 2,000 troops in this entire region, if we're being generous, is just really a really small amount when you compare it to much narrower areas that have much higher concentrations of much better equipped units and much better experienced units. And so definitely the Russians saw that and took advantage of it, and now that could be used to go village hopping. And these are larger villages. These are villages that have paved roads connecting to them. And so it's not the same as going into a relatively isolated hamlet and taking it over. This could actually have potential consequences even past Vuhledar itself, as we talked about previously. But if we're looking specifically at the Battle of Vuhledar, we've received reports from pro-Russian sources of Russian attempts at attacking frontally. Now, I can't verify this. There's no footage or Ukrainian reports saying this, but the general consensus from some Russian sources I've seen is that they've been able to advance all the way to the southern hospital here, and that they've done this along the paved road and through some of the plantations over here in the X. But again, it's not verified, so I haven't changed the map to reflect that. In reality, the Russian forces have put a lot more pressure from the eastern flank, for instance, taking over some of these hills that are located directly east of Vuhledar, because again, you have this higher elevated area that runs basically southeast of Vuhledar and then actually enters into the town. And that's an entire ridge that is split between Russian and Ukrainian control. So the Russians, to the extent that they are advancing from the east towards Vuhledar, they're doing it along those said hills that you see marked in yellow. Now, again, with the mine here, the Russians are trying to strengthen their positions because they did have to initially create a sort of spearhead that was rather deep and disconnected from their main nodes of attack in this area. Because if you think about it, the Russians are attacking horizontally, and in the horizontal direction going eastwards, the Russians don't have many large organization points to coordinate through to launch such attacks. They have to do so through the tree lines, and nearby villages include Solodka, which is really far away and really small. So then you have to do these operations through Mikilska, which is located further southwards, and it just isn't in sync with what we've seen from the footage showing Russian advances coming in directly horizontally. Also, Mikilske is relatively close to the front line, and so it's more susceptible to shelling if you organize a large number of troops and equipment in that one area before sending it out. But my point is, the Russian forces really are focusing on this eastern flank. They solidified control over what they already gained this past week in the mine, and they're fighting to reach the slag heap, which is still currently under mixed control. And then they took over 4.8 square kilometers west of the highway, infiltrating into Vodiane from the south. You can see they've reached the first dachas in the southern area, while the Ukrainians have been forced back even more. They've been forced back to natural barriers, whether they be ravines like this one here, or just general tree lines that you see marked in red. And as they continue to be pushed even farther back, Vodiane is a really small settlement, so there's not much left to hold over here. If you look at actual structures, there's a few houses left, there are warehouses, and then you have this residential portion in the north. But again, half of it is basically a gray zone, and the Russians have made it clear they're advancing along these parallel tree lines, doing so, first of all, in squads or in motorcycles, but then actually organizing with armored vehicles, MTLBs, tanks, BMPs, whatever it may be, pushing into an area like Vodiane from the north and then taking over those residential areas. That is a really palpable possibility. But what we've seen for now is that the Russians are focusing on that southern flank, trying to squeeze out the Ukrainian garrison and take control over, first of all, settlements, because they don't have many settlements nearby, as we said, but also a higher elevated region, which connects to this coal mine over here and would act as a flank targeting Vuhledar's supplies and overlooking its fields that are just to the north of Vuhledar. Now, to look north of Konstantinivka, the Russians are renewing assaults here. And in contrast to the sort of operations that are occurring around Vuhledar, over here you see much larger accumulations of Russian vehicles. And this is something that is really unique to the, I guess, Konstantinivka axis, whether it be north or south of the chain of villages. The Russians, they just have this disposition to organize large amounts of columns and push through on a daily basis, or throughout the entirety of a certain day, with dozens of vehicles, as I said. And this is despite the fact that, of course, when they're doing so, you have to come in with the understanding that there's going to be significant damage and also casualties to whatever infantry is mounted within those vehicles. But nonetheless, the Russians have continued doing that for over a year now. And really, the reason for that is they want to push the gray zone. They want to push the Overton window, if you will, westwards and continue doing so and dismount troops. And at least that some squads will be able to make it and then take over a static defensive position. That's the goal. And then afterwards, try to solidify control over it. And the best area to do such a thing is in an open area, such as the arena south of Konstantinivka, or this arena, as you could call it, north of Pokrovsk. So we're just seeing another example of that here. September 4th, 79th Air Assault Brigade repelled another Russian assault. This time they faced 17 Russian tanks and 4 armored fighting vehicles. In the process, they destroyed 3 armored fighting vehicles, damaged 1, and destroyed 3 tanks. So this time it's smaller numbers, because in other cases, the amount of damage to vehicles is actually over half of the total involved. So this case, it's less than that. And that's because the lead vehicles were spotted beforehand. This was not a surprise assault. The reconnaissance drones were prepared. And at that point, you had coordination between mortar, artillery, even mines were present in these fields. And of course, the troops that are located in the trenches and the drones. And so the Russians understood this and withdrew before there was any sort of colossal casualty resulting from it. And so the 79th Brigade, they claim to have killed 15 Russian soldiers and wounded 9 in this operation. And the front line has not changed since the last time we discussed this area north of Pokrovsk. But again, the goal is to reach the highway here, take over these 2 lines of Ukrainian defense that you see in yellow, and then use it as a flanking opportunity to take over hills that overlook the chain of villages that you see very, very close to the front line right now. Now, looking at Maximilianivka, this is really important because the Russians, they have not committed a large amount of resources to this village. But if there were to be some sort of faltering in the Ukrainian lines here, then I believe immediately the Russians would pounce upon that, and it would really kickstart a series of events that would really be unfavorable for the entire Ukrainian garrison, whether it be in this eastern area near Novelske all the way to Kurakhove. And so right now you have the 46th Brigade, or air assault units, that is operating here with some of its battalions. Also, at least 1 battalion of the 79th Brigade is supposed to be operating near this chain of villages spanning from Maximilianivka to Herhivka. The Russian forces, they accumulate forces in Herhivka, and then from there they send in these armored columns through a singular road. And that's why it's easy for the Ukrainians to spot them and concentrate their fire on a single region. And that's why generally they've been able to keep the Russians at bay. But in the cases where they fail to do so, the Russians could use that same route to advance really deep before they're actually repelled. And so now we have this footage. I don't think I have it on the geolocation over here, but it's a video of the 46th Brigade taking 9 Russian POWs in this eastern part of Maximilianivka. What this shows to us is that the Ukrainians are present in much more of the village than was previously imagined, which from a Ukrainian perspective is important because they don't want the Russians to muddy the waters here and gradually get control over more and more houses. So the Ukrainians have reversed the trend and are retaking some territory. But at the same time, you have the Russians building up additional forces in Herhivka for new plans to infiltrate deeper and deeper into the settlement. But for now, the news that I'm trying to report here is that the Ukrainians are holding on to this node here, and they're going to do so with a lot of tenacity, because losing it would mean giving the Russians direct access to Kurakhove, and then potentially opening up an access to cross over the Vavcha River and put pressure on Hirnik, Kurakhivka, and all these other villages that are not currently on the line of contact. They're still a couple of kilometers away, and that would just attack them from the south, an area that they really wouldn't have expected to endure attacks from. And in tandem with these Russian attempts, which I wouldn't call probing because they're actually using resources here, but they could be far more significant if the Russians understood that there was a high possibility of success. You're seeing something similar with the Russians sending in these columns, maybe 10 vehicles at a time with troops mounted in them. So it is a large assault, pushing along this rail axis or just parallel to it, with the goal of breaking out of the perimeter of Krasnohorivka and then advancing through this large swath of open fields where there isn't a lot of a Ukrainian defensive presence or any sort of defenders present at all, and then make it all the way to the Vavcha River cut off whatever remaining Ukrainian forces are in this huge salient that they really should gradually begin to withdraw from and reach all these really important Ukrainian villages with defenses in them, and some of them also being located on heights. That would be the sort of dream Russian scenario, and so that's why they are conducting these initial assaults with vehicles near the southwestern corner of Krasnohorivka. But for now, you have the 59th Brigade, specifically its 9th Motorized Battalion, and the 21st Battalion of the Presidential Brigade located over here, involved in repelling those Russian attacks. Now, moving on to Pokrovsk fronts, we're going to zoom in on Selidove. Again, it's very frustrating to see a lack of footage from the city center or even the peripheral parts of the city. What we do have, though, is just continued footage being released by the 15th Brigade from this certain rail bridge. And you can see this one over here from September 4th. It shows their tank destroying a Russian MTLB that was parked right under the bridge. And the fact that we're seeing just continued fighting here after a couple of days, it does indicate that the Russians have stalled to a certain extent. And I'd say to the extent where they can't move armored vehicles deeper than this point where I have the X marked. There's no proof of them doing so. And every time they've reached this X mark, they are engaged by either Ukrainians on foot, firing javelins or some other ATGM, or actual Ukrainian tanks being moved in and engaging them, keeping them at bay. So in that regard, the Russians have failed to move in a large quantity of forces using vehicles deeper into Selidove, which gives the Ukrainians a breath of fresh air and time to sort of regroup their forces in the center without being really pressed on as directly as it could have been in the worst case scenario. At the same time, there's a discussion of DRGs infiltrating past here, doing so on foot and operating in this general X area. Again, every day we talk about the possibility, but it's just entertaining it for the moment. But what it shows is that the 15th Brigade and Ukrainian forces in general could still make the journey from the center of Selidove all the way to the sort of western parts of Mikhailivka to just try to conduct strike missions and fire towards the Russians as they begin to accumulate more forces in Mikhailivka. Because regardless of their lack of advances in recent days, they definitely are building up a strong garrison here, and that's not going away. The Ukrainians aren't really able to push them out. They don't have that wherewithal. The best they can do is really build up their own defense and then try to send in small elements, whether it be assault forces or just vehicles, to try to fire towards whatever Russian forces get close to the line of contact. So that's just a lot of what we're seeing in recent days from this area. Looking a bit northwards at Novohordivka, as we said before, it's been fully captured by the Russians and the perimeter is being cleared. We could see that the Russians were able to advance actually 0.8 square kilometers based on a really interesting video that we're going to talk about. So the markers over here, Ukrainian tank crew from the 93rd Mechanized Brigade released a 5-minute video showing their operations north of Novohordivka. So the tank crew, they pass through settlements parallel to tree lines, and then they set up this position over here with the X, and then they fire a couple hundred meters, maybe it's like 800 meters eastwards towards Russian positions based on where they're firing towards and where the explosion occurs near this mine over here. I think it's called Novohordivka 2, the mine here in the slag heap. So firing towards there and firing towards fields located just south of it. And the indication is if they're firing towards there, they're definitely Russians located in most of this northernmost district of Novohordivka you see with the X over here, and in the facilities around the mine. Now, it's not to say that they control the slag heap itself, but they're surrounding it at this point. And the Ukrainians, there's no indication that they actually remain here. In all likelihood, the Ukrainian infantry squads have fully withdrawn from the environs of this area, and they may have some presence in the trenches spanning from Mykolaiivka to Chasiv Yar, but not south of that. But then you do have everyday tank crews now from the 93rd Brigade crossing over those trenches and engaging with Russian forces that may be trying to conduct forays and clear up the remaining gray zone that is near these trenches, because doing so would give the Russians a springboard to actually infiltrate into some of those trenches. So it's really a matter of keeping them at bay. It's important to mention that it's the 93rd Brigade, because now we're going to go on a tangent about this unit. This 93rd Mechanized Brigade, one of Ukraine's most experienced units, really well equipped, really large units, and has been fighting in so many parts of the front line. Right before it was moved to here, because the first publicly available footage came out today. Before today, it was operating split between the general Volchansk, Lipsy area. It had a presence over there, and also south of Chasiv Yar around Klishivka. Those were its arenas, and honestly, you could say that each arena had a brigade's worth of men if you're talking about a regular strength Ukrainian brigade. But the 93rd is so much larger than your average Ukrainian units. So just to give some perspective, the 93rd Brigade has 3 mechanized battalions, 2 motorized battalions, 2 rifle battalions, a tank battalion, an artillery group, and then the Signum Battalion, which is their drone reconnaissance units. And they have another one, this Raven group, which is another reconnaissance drone battalion. And then they have 2 other battalions that have been, they were previously independent and then got attached to the 93rd Brigade and are part of its general structure. And so if you're just looking at the core, then it's 8 battalions, or I should say it's 7 battalions of actual infantry. And then you could add in 2 more, so it could be probably around 9, in addition to all the drone and tank and artillery and logistics units added together. And so it's a really significant size, much larger than any other ones that you see here operating. And we don't know if the entirety of the brigade was moved in or if only the element that was operating south of Chasiv Yar, because that would be more realistic. And in that case, you could say perhaps it's upwards of 4,000 troops that could be moved into this arena if the entire element from Klishivka was moved away. Because this unit, and I'm just going off of the estimate, adding up all the battalion sizes, maybe they're not at full strength, but if they were to be, then it would probably be close to around 8,000 soldiers in total, which is just insane for a brigade. It's double the sort of maximum size, which is generally recognized nowadays. And also because of the fact that it's been operating in 2 parts of the front line that haven't been as active, they're not at the forefront of the fighting with the most casualties, then recently it hasn't been attrited that much. And so it just would seem logical from a Ukrainian perspective to move them away in order to sort of give the 47th Brigade some rest, because I would say they're sort of equivalent, these 2 units, in terms of their stature and their equipment. So in all likelihood, the 47th Brigade has been rotated out and is no longer fighting and has been replaced by the 93rd, which has at least its tank battalion operating around here, firing towards the Russians. So just as a brief summary, over the past few months, when the Russians have been just continually advancing past the Vovcha River westwards towards Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians moved in at least 6 brigades, and this could be 7 if you include the 117th Mechanized Brigade, but there's not enough proof to definitively say they have been moved in from another area like the Kurakhove sector to defend over here. It's just very, very scant. But the 6 ones that we do have enough proof surrounding their movement include the 119th Territorial Defense Brigade, moved in very recently to defend along the Vovcha River. Then in Selidove, the 15th Brigade National Guard unit that was defending around Kurakhove. To the north, 93rd Brigade, at least their element from the Chasiv Yar region, has been moved in. 71st Jaeger Brigade moved in from the Volchansk area. And then you have to the north, the 14th National Guard Brigade, also, I believe, moved in from that general Kurakhove sector. So you see a common theme of a lot of these units coming in from areas of the front line that really are not seeing that much fighting. So they have a higher level of readiness, for instance. But then in terms of their caliber, they're much lower quality. You also have some units that are newly formed, like the 151st Brigade, and that's the 6th unit that was moved in, and actually the first one out of the 6 that I mentioned. Besides brigades, you also have elements of units that were moved in, like the 35th National Guard Regiment that was moved in. You also have the Birds of Magyar Air Reconnaissance Regiment, and specifically its Tactical Group Atom, which is a detachment of said regiment. Really important drone units that are, of course, providing support for the Ukrainians just northeast of Pokrovsk in this case. And so again, you're seeing that definitely the Ukrainians have made an effort to solidify the line here and move in a significant amount of reinforcements, but you're looking at the sort of units being moved in, their quality, and then comparing it to the reinforcements that were sent into Kursk, and you could see that the Ukrainians really do have an interest in continuing with their Kursk offensive, continuing to have a presence there, so much so that they're willing to sacrifice the possibility of diverting some elite units away from the offensive activities to actually engage with defending over here. And so then what's left to fill the vacuum are all these lesser units like National Guard units or newly formed units that weren't really that experienced or really have as good of equipment and men. And they're the ones that are currently engaged with the defending here. Of course, the exception is the 93rd Brigade, as we're going to get to now. So here you guys can see the theater where the 93rd Brigade previously had half of its unit located in. You can see it with this X. This is a really important sector. And it doesn't appear that way because it's generally open and not many settlements are here. But you do see that there's a really high concentration of Ukrainian units. Some of them might be outdated. Some of them are also drone units, so it's a bit sort of confusing to see them in tandem with the brigades. But you have the 5th Assault Brigade operating here, for instance. You have at least a certain element of this territorial defense unit here. You have the IDAR regiment, I believe they're called. And you did have previously the 93rd Assault Brigade in addition to the 92nd or 93rd Mechanized in addition to the 92nd Assault Brigade operating here. Now the 93rd has been moved away, but they played a huge role in keeping firm this front line, first in Klishivka, but then after being pushed away from it, holding on to some of the nearby trenches and forested areas, and this really dragged out for a long time and prevented any sort of deep Russian exploitation. Now, almost immediately after the 93rd Brigade was moved away, the Russians sensed an opportunity and began to pounce over here and took advantage of their frontline positions in Klishivka and near this height over here, height 215, and very quickly expanded westwards, getting control over local paved roads, forested areas, open fields, and then also a lot of Ukrainian fortresses that were built in recent years to hold on and drag out the fighting. But due to the pace and due to the lack of Ukrainian response and density over here, then the Russians were able to steamroll past and make it all the way to the canal, all the way to the Donbass Canal. If we're measuring it, it's a size of around 4.7 square kilometers. And then the advance from Klishivka amounts to, let's see, 3 kilometers westward. So it is a significant advance. We can see the geolocation here from the Dodo drone unit. It's a drone unit of the, I think, 4th Battalion of the 5th Assault Brigade. And so they just were able to spot some isolated Russian soldiers walking around here within the canal itself, which again doesn't really have water in it, and then dropping grenades onto them. That's an indication to us that the Russian troops have already begun operating here, and really at the same time you could assume they're also operating in the tree lines to the east. And so the Russian troops are beginning to flood into this area, trying to change the status of the fighting here, creating a wedge between the Ukrainian positions to the north that are located around this really dense forested area, and then to the south in this open region with some trenches. And the goal of the Russians is to fully cleanse Ukrainians from the eastern side of the canal. The reason for doing so is that the canal itself is on really high elevation, and that includes both the eastern and western sides of it. So the eastern side is largely under Ukrainian control, or at least it was. Now it's mostly under Russian or in a gray zone. And so the Russians are trying to consolidate control over these higher elevated areas, and it would give them the opportunity to then be on equal playing field with the Ukrainian positions that are also on relatively high elevation west of the canal. Getting control over those positions would give the Russians a perfect field of view into Stopochki and to various other villages running along the T0504 highway into Konstantinivka. So long-term, looking into the valley on which Konstantinivka is located would be really critical for the Russians. But then at the same time, they could use their positions east, or I should say west of the canal, to flank Chasiv Yar from an area that is actually on similar elevation, and then put pressure from a new axis. And so it has a dual role, and this is sort of looking more long-term into the future. But due to the Russians already reaching the canal, then the possibility is definitely there for the Russians to actually begin flanking operations that could see a significant change to the equation with the Battle of Chasiv Yar, which so far has been fought directly from an eastern advance by the Russians. That could all change due to the 93rd Brigade being moved away, and thus reducing the troop density of the Ukrainian forces on this southern flank, and also taking away the best units invariably leads to these sort of consequences. And so that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.